You're listening to Past Imperfect, a history podcast brought to you by the Center for Wisdom and Leadership at SPJIMR. I'm Dinyar Patel. Radio's golden days in South Asia are long past, but the history of radio can still tell us a great deal about how popular culture and political power continue to interact in the region. Today, I'm joined by Isabel Huacuja Alonso, the author of Radio for the Millions. Huacuja Alonso's book examines how, before television and the internet, people listened to and communicated news, and, most poignantly, used radio to find commonalities across hostile borders. Stations like Radio Ceylon united Indian and Pakistani listeners with a shared love of filmi music. While radio could occasionally strengthen state agendas, it could also remind listeners of shared cultures, languages, and histories. Thank you, Isabel, for joining us today. Your book, Radio for the Millions, tracks the history of radio across the divide of 1947 and across three different countries, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Can you tell us how radio began in colonial South Asia and how its development was different from the development of radio in other countries and regions around the world?
Sure. Dinyar, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to talk to you about my book, Radio for the Millions. So as I trace in the book, in the first chapters of the book, and in the section 1 of the book, radio had a very difficult start in South Asia. And there were a multiple number of reasons for that. But really the primary reason for it is in around the 1930s, the British government quickly realized that radio could be used as a way to broadcast nationalist and anti-colonial ideas. And that deeply worried the British administration. So that hindered any kind of development of radio broadcasting in South Asia. Even as the administration paid lip service to the idea that they were developing the medium, it still sort of stopped them from doing so. And it was really not until World War II when broadcasts from Japan, Germany, and Italy really began to gain popularity that the British administration realized that they had to develop the medium of radio to counteract these broadcasts. And that was a turning point. It doesn't mean that that All India Radio didn't exist earlier. It doesn't mean that there wasn't investment, but it was always lukewarm investment. And this is something that people that were involved in radio broadcasting, including writers, including people in administration, were very aware of and wrote about.
Yeah, you mentioned in your book about how around the time that radio is beginning in India, you have the Empire service that's launched by the BBC. You have a lot of interest from particular individuals at the BBC to invest in radio in India, and yet the colonial government just seems to kind of be in its usual manner, kind of reactionary and uninterested in developing this medium at all.
Yeah, that's correct. It's never sort of said explicitly. So you have to sort of read between the lines in the archives to understand that. Again, there's always lip service that radio is important, that we're going to develop it, that we have to serve the Indian people, that we're going to have it in many languages. But the money is just never there. And yes, you're completely right. So one of the stories that is told on the radio is that, first of all, receivers were exorbitantly expensive. And it was and they were very highly taxed. And that meant that it was just very expensive to get access to a radio. But when the Empire service began to broadcast, which was a broadcasting system that was meant to really broadcast to British people, as well as English-speaking Indians. And can we edit that part out? Is that possible?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So it was really, when the Empire service began, it was really, it gained a lot of interest, and it really increased the number of radio receivers people were buying and the taxation for it. Right. So radio shops owners began to say that those taxes needed to be used to develop radio in India.
Speaking of that, you mentioned about how radio in India was a group experience. People would gather in shops outside a pan shop or a chai stand or an electronics store, as you mentioned, and listen to it. Now, history shows us many other examples of how radio has been kind of a community listening experience, whether it's the fireside chats of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the United States during World War II and the Great Depression, or On another extreme, common listening practices in places like Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union. How is group listening different in South Asia? And how is it unique in comparison to these other group listening practices?
Yes, group listening in community, listening by groups is important in an earlier time period and continues until, I would say, the 80s. This is not necessarily unique to South Asia. As you point out, it's actually historians of radio had shown how listening in community, listening beyond just sort of the family, but in neighborhoods was actually common. There, throughout the world, there are particular differences, though, that I think are important to point out. One is the length of time that remains important. So usually the break is the transistor. With the coming and the popularization of the transistor, radio scholars have written about the individualization of radio listening. That's not the case in South Asia. People continue to listen to radio, particularly to Hindi film songs and Hindi film song programs on the transistor, but also in community. And there are sort of signs that show us that. We can see it through the letters that do that, but also even through the advertisements of transistors, which always talk about the importance of loudness, because there's an expectation that it's going to be listening in group. The other difference in South Asia that I would argue is a difference, but one that is actually shared, is that radio, it's not just that people are listening in groups, but that it's not only the listening of radio that becomes important, but the conversations around radio. This is really crucial to think about the World War II time period, when the ownership of radio receivers was quite restricted, in great part due to the British administration's reluctance to develop the medium. So a question that I faced is like, why is there so much obsession about the effect of access broadcasts on Indian audiences if there are such few receivers compared to the size of the population? And the answer lied really in the fact that people were talking about those broadcasts, and that those conversations about the broadcasts were crucial to radio. And this notion is what I use for the concept of radio resonance, sort of the idea that the talk about radio, the rumor around radio, is as important as the radio broadcast. That is crucial in an earlier time period, but it remains crucial in a later time period, even when transistors are widely available. So, for example, for radio programs like the ever popular Binaka Gitmala that ranked songs by order of popularity, relied on word of mouth as well, because it consciously asked listeners to talk about songs and to talk about the rankings, right? So I would say that in South Asia, radio resonance becomes crucial. It's not just the community listening, but the talking about that radio broadcast that becomes really important. I would say that I think that phenomena is really much more important in South Asia, and I would argue in the global South, but that phenomena is actually crucial to understanding radio everywhere. And that takes place in a number of parts, including parts of Europe and North America as well. And that's something that I outline in the book. The trick is really that I think that we should really our study of the medium needs to start from here, rather than the other way around that often has happened, rather than from the global north.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, building on that, I mean, when you're talking about things like tracing rumors or community listening habits or thinking about how people talked about the radio, all of this points to a big challenge in your project. I mean, it must have been extremely difficult to do the archival research for this project. I mean, for many of us, if we look at a historical project, we just go into the archive and we follow a paper trail. And in your case, as you mentioned in your book, that paper trail doesn't oftentimes exist, right? I mean, you can't, in many cases, find old recordings of radio programs. Sometimes the recordings wouldn't have existed in the first place, or they are transcripts, or people have jotted down what they recall from, what they listened on the radio. Can you tell us a little bit about the particular challenges that you faced in researching this book?
Oh, absolutely. So it's a book that has about a little bit more than a decade of research, and it has followed archives literally everywhere. So unlike other sort of stories that we want to tell, the study of radio doesn't exist. You're unable to find it if only go to the Indian National Archives or the British Library, which tend to be the to-go places for historians. I sort of had to follow them anywhere that they can possibly take me. And the way that I began this research, which was incredibly helpful, was through oral histories with broadcasters and with listeners. And it was by interviewing them about their experience working for radio and listening for radio, and sort of telling me about particular moments that were important in radio broadcasting, and then following those moments through various archives. And sort of that varied through the time period that I worked on. So for the 1930s to 1945, the World War II time period, we were actually fortunate that the British government was so paranoid about access radio broadcasts that they actually transcribed almost every single word that was said on the radio. And those copies were available at the National Archives of India in Delhi, and I was able to trace those. For the period of where I focused on music in the post-independence time period, I had to rely on a number of sources. So I went to Radio Ceylon itself in Sri Lanka to look at schedules. I interviewed people there. Then I relied on letters and diaries that were kept by listeners that I was able to trace little by little. And for the 1965 war, I was able to actually find an entire collection, a large collection in Radio Pakistan of the 1965 war. And ironically, my challenge there was dealing with an abundance of recordings and how to actually study something that was broadcast 13 hours a day, right? How to actually look at that. And for the IIR Urdu service, I was able to, it's a later time period, so I was able to interview a number of broadcasters that were part of the AIR Urdu service. And through them, I was able to access their personal collections of letters and recordings as well, letters and recordings, and to read that alongside newspapers, alongside accounts, personal accounts, everything that I could possibly find. To summarize it, I really followed the radio airwaves in every way I possibly could, and every clue that I was given. And that's sort of the way that this was put together, by gathering sources across many places.
So one of the points that you make relatively early in the book is that radio allows us to see so much of South Asian history in a different perspective. And the first big moment that you cover in your book is World War II, where you focus on how, after the war began in 1939, Axis powers, so Japan, Italy, and Germany, set up stations to broadcast in Hindustani to Indian audiences, gaining a remarkably wide listenership. So what made these Axis radio stations so appealing to Indians during the war? And what does this appeal tell us about the state of British rule in India during this time?
Yeah, so Axis radio stations became very appealing to Indian listeners, and as well as to those that would talk about them, because the British government, after the break of the war, very actively began to censor news regarding the war, as well as news regarding the anti-colonial movement. So there was just an absolute lack of trust in the existing media. And Access radio broadcast provided an outside perspective of it. As I write in the book, Access radio broadcasts were also incredibly anti-Semitic. They exaggerated the truth. They also broadcast outlined lies about battles and about developments in the war. And they were very incendiary. But at the same time, they alleged solidarity with the nationalist movement. Of course, we all know that that's extremely problematic, given at the very least Hitler's views on India. But that created a sense that we can get a different perspective from here. And that allowed people to really see radio as a place of where you can find a different perspective, and almost as a place of resistance as well. Right. And this is really what I believe accounted for the popularity of it. The other thing that is really, really important about Access radio broadcasts, and at least I tried to explain in the book, is really their success in the use of language. And this is something that the British administration in India certainly noticed, which is that they broadcast in Indian languages. They move away from English broadcasting, but they also very much utilize Hindustani and the notion of Hindustani in North India. And they did so effectively. And that sort of certainly helped the radio stations have popularity at that time period.
And you point out that at this time, AIR was mostly broadcasting in English, right? Before the war?
AIR was certainly making an effort to increase their broadcasting in Indian languages, in Hindustani, but also in other Indian languages. But they hadn't done so. They were not able to sort of gain popularity at the time period because their broadcasts remained to be very didactic, which is something that, and also it was deeply censored. So they couldn't, for example, broadcast Gandhi's speeches at the time period until much later, until really after the war that they began to effectively do that. So it sort of felt banal when there's an entire anti-colonial movement, the war going here, and such extreme censorship going on. But I want to emphasize that I really think that it was the censorship of newspapers. And when the censorship of newspapers became really strong after 1942, that's really a turning moment in radio broadcasting and in the popularity of access radio broadcasts. Not just who heard them, but who talked about them.
And of course, a big figure around that moment was Subhash Chandra Bose. And you talk a lot about Bose and his Azad Hind radio, which was supported by both the Japanese and the German governments. You point out that he was really the only nationalist leader in the pre-independence era to harness the power of radio and harness the power of the airwaves. At the same time, you demonstrate that study of the radio and his broadcasts particularly allow us to see some more troubling aspects of Bose's politics, particularly his ties to and his affinities for fascist politics. How precisely does radio provide us with a more complete picture of Bose's last few years as a political leader?
I think radio really brings you to the essence of Bose's role during World War II. So most histories of Bose have focused on telling a life story across it, and while that's not necessarily incorrect, I think that often distorts what really happens in the World War II time period and moves us away from thinking of Bose as a wartime World War II character and what his alliance with Axis powers actually meant. So the standard narrative in history has been that the alliance with Axis powers was an opportunistic one. I don't think that the opportunistic part is necessarily wrong, but what that fails to see is how his voice was heard in the context of Axis propaganda. And what the book shows is that Bose's voice could not have been necessarily separated. Neither could have Azad Hind radio from Axis propaganda to India. That was Axis propaganda on the radio. That was so increasingly popular and important to the media scenario there. And that when we see him in that context, it's very difficult to separate him from the Axis powers that support him. And in many ways, it's actually unethical for us as historians to do that, because that's not the way in which contemporaries would have heard his voice. The chapter, though, that focuses on Subhash Chandra Bose also makes another argument that I think is really powerful, which is it brings back to the idea of radio resonance, and that the number of people that would have actually heard his voice were actually quite limited. However, that didn't mean that radio was not important or that his broadcasting on radio was not important, because the talk and rumor that surrounded those broadcasts were so crucial to his political persona. And I connect those rumors to the later rumors of him after his death, that he was sort of still alive and that he returns to. And one of the points that I make here is that rumor was always his medium. Rumor was not sort of the medium afterwards, after his life. It was always his medium. If we sort of concentrate on him about at the high point of his career as during the war, right? So I think, and this also allows me to sort of be in conversation with radio studies. And one of the things that I try to think about is how is it that Subhash Chandra Bose created intimacy with listeners? And in radio studies, the notion of intimacy and the creation of intimacy through the ear is really crucial, but it always focuses on the way people speak intimately. And I try to turn that around and say the ways in which we force people to talk about us, right, is also a way of creating intimacy. And actually rumor, and in this particular chapter, I talk about gossip. It's actually a very important aspect of the medium as well, and the ways in which it creates intimacy with its audiences.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable how you describe in the book about how, we from our perspective, we think of Bose as a figure who is constantly resurrected after his death in 1945, but he was resurrecting himself well before then, right? I mean, you point
Oh
out in one
yes.
broadcast he was responding to rumors that were broadcast by the BBC, and even people like Gandhi believed it, that he had died in a plane accident, and he came on the radio and said, he's still alive and he's planning to
That's
still
right.
broadcast.
What was it? News of my death were wishful thinking. Is what sort of what he says in the radio. That's correct. That's right. And I can't. I have it in the book, but I can't remember off the top of my hand. One particular news services wrongly first broadcasts that Bose had been killed when he hadn't been killed, and then a few other news agencies take it up and continuing, among them the BBC. And Bose later comes out from Asad Hind Radio and says that news of my death are wishful thinking, right? And he does so on the radio. So, and yes, in a way, he's resurrected himself. And during World War II, his voice was really what was present, much not his body. So in the sense, he was being resurrected and had a ghostly presence even during the war.
Yeah, as you point out, I mean, the only times he really comes back onto Indian territory after that is, I mean, when he goes to the Andamans, right? And then, or at least the INA forces go to the Andamans, and then afterward during the battle on the borders of India and Burma towards the end of the war.
And this is really one of the chapters where I really try to sort of dig the point in and make it clear that radio history is history, in the sense that paying attention to radio really allows us to think about, and to radio and sound history general, really allows us to question sort of standard ideas of South Asian history.
So I'm going to move on now from World War II into the immediate post-war era. And this is an era where we find radio, amongst many other things in the subcontinent, being partitioned, if you will. How did radio change in the turbulent years between the end of the war and 1947, when India and Pakistan achieved their independence? And how in particular did certain leaders, for example, Vallabhbhai Patel, who was Minister for Information and Broadcasting in the interim government, affect these changes?
I think, as I had mentioned earlier, the book focuses on particular moments, and the first moment, as we mentioned, is World War II. The second moment is the immediate post-independence time period, and it looks at the role of music during this time period. And following independence and partition and the division of India, colonial India into Pakistan and India, and Radio Pakistan, as well as All India Radio, we have an increasingly focus of thinking about what radio can do and what radio should do for creating national audiences. And here I focus on a large social uplift campaign that takes place in All India Radio in the 1950s. And it takes place under B.V. Keskar, the Minister of Information. And he's someone who is deeply committed to music and to Hindustani classical music, and to a lesser extent Carnatic classical music as well. And he believes that radio is the way to create a national soundscape, and that the promotion of classical music is the way to do so. And he also does so through the promotion of Hindi as a national language. A project that Patel had actually started earlier, prior to independence. He sort of continues to it. And it's a large uplifting moment where All India Radio is sort of where B.V. Keskar tries to remake All India Radio. This leads to the famous ban of Hindi film songs that takes place in 1952. And really, it has a ton of resistance from listeners. The didactic programs that All India Radio starts are not welcomed by listeners. There is a lot of complaints about the ban of Hindi film songs. There is a lot of complaints about the forcing of classical music into listeners. There's also a lot of complaints about the language of All India Radio being completely ununderstandable, that listeners could not understand it because it was so highly Sanskritized. And at this very moment, in what is now Sri Lanka, what was then Ceylon, you have the growth of a commercial radio station, ironically using a transmitter from the British from World War II that can be heard very well in India. And this commercial station begins what is known as Radio Ceylon, which becomes the leading station really for the next 3 decades. And that for the most part broadcasts Hindi film song and Hindi film song related programs. So the fourth chapter of the book relates the ways in which that radio station rise to prominence, how it becomes what listeners often calls king of the airwaves, and the ways it really helps make Hindi film songs the soundtrack of South Asia. and that in doing so, Radio Ceylon harnesses an audience that is beyond borders, not only in India, but as well as in Pakistan. Radio Ceylon could be heard clearly in Pakistan, and it develops a very large audience there as well. And it goes very much against the kinds of projects that were developed both by All India Radio and B.B. Keskar during that time period, but also by Radio Pakistan.
So as you mentioned, B.B. Keskar, when he was minister, banned Hindi film songs on the airwaves in India in 1952. And as you recall in your book, this was an extremely controversial moment. And it's quite remarkable that one man could have so much power to dictate the listening habits of an entire nation, right? I mean, one man decided that film music was somehow lewd or too Western or too decadent, and therefore there needs to be kind of a top-down project at a culture of cultural learning on the part of the Indian citizenry to develop an appreciation for classical music. What does this tell us about politics in the Nehruvian era, that so much power was given to one individual to determine something like this?
First of all, I'm speaking, so it's a podcast, so you can't see me, just like on the radio, but I'm saying ban with quotations. There's never a formal ban. It's a number, as I describe in the book, there's a number of incidents that led to the removal of Hindi film songs from there for about a period of 7 years. Yes, one of the things I tried to emphasize, B.B. Keskar had a lot of power over All India Radio, and his decisions did have a lot of power. But in reality, if we look at what happens in All India Radio during this time period, actually, it does not go against a lot of the policies that are taking place in Nehruvian India at the time period. The idea behind the banning of film songs is actually in line with the socialist project that looks askance or hears at anything, at a commercial form of music. So part of B.B. Keskar's critique of Hindi film songs was its commerciality, that it was the fact that it was a commercial form of music, and a strong belief that the government would be able to produce better music. In fact, there's a program that begins called Sugam Sangeet that Anil Biswas actually becomes involved in that. And it's an attempt to create light music by the government. So that was one. And the other aspect is that Keskar also, in addition to having the better known ban on Hindi film songs, he also very much centralizes production in All India Radio. And he believes that music should be produced from Delhi, and sort of Hindustani classical music from Delhi. And that centralization and that idea of centralization is actually in line with the Nehruvian way of thinking. And one of the arguments that I try to make is that these kinds of nationalist projects that had communal tendencies are actually also part of that legacy, and that the idealization of that time period can be problematic, or the idealization in historical records that we have can be problematic. And I urge scholars to sort of look at this moment not as the way it's often put in when it's described as like a random ban of Hindi film songs, but as a part of a larger context.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm thinking of Taylor Sherman's recent book where she talks about how the period of time when Nehru's in power can be seen through several myths. And one myth that you kind of helped explode over here is how this was an era of absolute secularism, and an era which democracy was firmly in place. And certainly amongst the listening habits of Indians, people might have tended to disagree, since they couldn't listen to film songs, at least tuning into AIR. So you talk about how AIR's venture into classical music was something that really benefited Radio Ceylon. Radio Ceylon from the 1950s had captured a lot of the interest of individuals in India and Pakistan by having these programs where they broadcast Hindi film songs to audiences around the subcontinent. And you mentioned a popular joke at the time, which was 9 out of 10 receivers in India were tuned into Radio Ceylon, and the 10th was out of service. How significant was Radio Ceylon in shaping a shared popular culture in South Asia right after partition?
Extremely, is the way that I would answer. I mean, I think the joke, 9 out of 10, is actually accurate in every way, form. I mean, Radio Ceylon, talk to anyone over the age of 50 and they will tell you that they grew up listening to Radio Ceylon. Radio Ceylon was the to-go radio station. That's why when people sort of ask me, like, why did you not focus on state you're sort of paying too much attention to what's outside of the state, right? actually, that I think that analysis is wrong. The only reason why I focused on Radio Ceylon is because I began with the listener, because I began paying attention to what listeners were actually listening to. And that was really the number one radio station that people listened from the 1950s, I would argue, all the way to the 1970s. All the way to then. And it was the primary form of entertainment, not just a primary form of listening, the primary form of entertainment for people in India and Pakistan. And it was a shared soundscape across, I would argue, North India and Pakistan. It also shaped the way people experience film songs. I talk about how the various radio programs created certain forms of listening to songs, but it also shaped the way people experience film. I would say that the book is very much in conversation and draws on the rich literature that we have on film in South Asia. At the same time, I think that a lot of that literature has focused on the visuality of film. And this sort of tries to bring it across and say, listen, people listen to the radio 7 hours a day, 4 hours a day, maybe 7 hours a day. And they might have watched a film at the most, maybe twice a month, 3 times a month. So that experience was crucial. And listening to the radio did not mean only listening to songs. It meant listening to songs and descriptions of films as well. It meant paying attention to particular communities and fan communities that were built through radio listening. No, and this is also the chapter where I was able to really work closely with the broadcaster Amin Sayani, who we were fortunate to still have with us, and with his work and with his collections.
I think one point that you make that's really important is that for many people in South Asia, listening to a radio broadcast of a Hindi film song was probably the closest that people would get to experience of a film, right? I mean, because films were still quite expensive; they'd only be played at a theater once, and people might be able to see them once or twice. But on the radio, a much wider section of people across India and Pakistan were able to either listen to songs for the first time or get a sense of what a movie was, or relive an experience of what it was like to see a particular film in a movie theater.
Oh, yes, absolutely. When I went to Radio Ceylon to do research, I met an elderly couple that was traveling outside of India for the first time, who were also visiting the radio station. And the irony of it is that one of them, I can't remember who, one of them had actually seen very few films for a variety of reasons, but he was a devoted fan of radio. So absolutely. I mean, I think I think that radio should be studied on its own right and doesn't need to constantly be compared to film. At the same time, I think that historians of film should pay more attention to the ways in which films were experienced orally and on the airwaves in particular.
And the other interesting thing about Radio Ceylon is just its participative character, right? In the sense that you talk about how people like Amin Sayani would receive as many as 65,000 letters every week at the beginning of his program from listeners who were responding to, efforts to get them to participate in the rankings of songs. It really seems in many ways that radio, and particularly Radio Ceylon over here, is helping to democratize a certain type of culture, create almost a form of popular culture with very active participation on the part of people in South Asia.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I would use the word democratize here, but I think that there was an ultra-participatory culture that develops, I would argue, begins in the 1950s and really sort of blooms in the 60s and 70s. And that ultra-participatory culture is one in which it really involves listeners in radio programs and uses listener-authored content in the actual radio programs. So Binaka Gidmala, the better known one, is a hit parade system that relies on sales as well as listeners' votes. But during this time period, we developed a number of radio programs that actually rely entirely on listener-author content, on letters, on specific stories that they write. I'm currently writing a separate article about fan fiction that was read on the airwaves on Radio Ceylon as well as the AIR Urdu service. And participation is really at the key of this time period. And that participation always relies on a kind of radio resonance. That is the talking about radio that becomes crucial.
So in the last two chapters of your book, you focus on the competing agendas of Radio Pakistan and AIR during and after the 1965 India-Pakistan war. And one particular individual really stands out from this part of your book, the famed actress and singer Noor Jahan, who had a career before partition and then migrated to Pakistan and had a career as a singer over there as well. And you show how Noor Jahan was used in very different ways for very different political messages and messaging by both the Indian and Pakistani radio services. Can you tell us a bit more about how her radio voice was used to send different political messages by these two competing radio services?
He's one of my favorite characters in the book. And in one of the interviews, I was asked, like, if you could meet any academic, who would you meet? An interview about the book. And I was like, well, I don't know if I would meet any academic, but I would meet her. I would want to meet her, right? I'm more interested in meeting her. But yes, I mean, the third section of the book focuses on the 1965 Indo-Pakistan War and its aftermath. And the 1965 Indo-Pakistan War in history is sort of like almost unimportant conflict between India and Pakistan over Kashmir that takes place in 1965. That lasts a few days, and that sort of results in a military stalemate and sort of leads to problems. But the real issue is 1971. In the book, I argue that 1965 is actually a crucial moment, and I talk about the important role of radio broadcasting by Radio Pakistan in creating a sense of war. And Noor Jahan here plays a huge role because what she does is that she volunteers. By this time, she's no longer in the film industry. She has migrated to Pakistan from India, and she's no longer in the film industry. And she volunteers to come to Radio Pakistan. She famously comes in a white sari, and she sings on the radio. And she performs a number of patriotic songs for Radio Pakistan, which were composed then by a group of musicians and by her as well. And the songs become memorable. They're still sort of widely circulated in Pakistan when I was there. And she becomes sort of the symbol of a warring Pakistan. And and a symbol of a warring Pakistan against an Indian aggressor, which is the narrative that was pushed by Radio Pakistan at the time period. And she's really the national symbol of that. In the aftermath of the 1965 war, and in response to that, Indira Gandhi develops the All India Radio Urdu service, which in reality is supposed to only target Urdu-speaking audiences in Pakistan, and to provide news of the war, provide news of the war and the war's aftermath and the negotiations from an Indian perspective. And that's because during the 1965 war, you have the complete breakdown of diplomatic relationships. So the service is meant to do that, but it's slow. Broadcasters realize that Pakistanis really want to hear Hindi film songs. So they begin playing that, and the service really becomes 8 hours a day, most of it dedicated to entertainment and to music, and it's only a small part dedicated to news. And within this service, which grows in the years to come and becomes very popular in India as well, even though that's never the intended audience, and becomes sort of a connection across India and Pakistan. At the very time that Radio Ceylon's popularity is decreasing because of the deterioration of the transmitter. Within this service, a broadcaster begins a program called Awaaz De Kahan Hai, which is the name of one of her famous songs, as I'm sure many are aware of. And Noor Jahan becomes the central voice of that program. And that program is about the exchange of letters between Indian and Pakistani listeners, talking about a shared past. So it's rather ironic because, and actually rather conscious, as the broadcaster does it consciously, because Abdul Jabbar, the broadcaster and host of that program, uses the voice of Noor Jahan to talk about connections across both sides of the border and a shared past, against the kind of programming that had been done earlier during the 1965 war that used Noor Jahan's voice as the voice of Pakistani nationalism.
Yeah, the one thing that really is quite apparent from your book is that radio in many ways is a way to kind of get across these borders and allow people on both sides of a very, very hard border. I mean, as you mentioned, diplomatic relations broke down by 1965. And of course, we still live in an era where communication between India and Pakistan is extremely difficult. Yet through radio, you have people who are communicating with one another. You even mentioned in the book that people like Nur Jahan are in some ways responding to what's happening across the border. She and Lata Mangeshkar, as you mentioned in your book, were kind of competing as big playback singers in the era. And when Lata Mangeshkar gave a patriotic rendition of a song, Nur Jahan felt it almost obligatory to respond in 1965 and become a patriotic singer as well. So, in many ways, you really show over here how radio knits together two countries which otherwise are at a moment of an extreme hostility by 1965.
I mean, absolutely. And I think that's sort of the leading theme of the book, the ways in which radio is able to contest state agendas. It contests first the state agenda of the British administration during World War II with access radio broadcasts. Then it contests the state agenda of Bibi Keskar and his kind of social uplift program with Radio Ceylon and with the role of Radio Ceylon and Hindi film programs, and then Hindi film song programs. And then it contests the state agenda of the 1965 war with the rise of the AIR Urdu service and its cross-border audience. So this is sort of the story that I choose to center in the book. And it's a story that I chose to center in the book because it's the story that most strongly resonated with listeners. It is the story. It is really what they were tuning into at the time and what mattered to them. During World War II, there's really little doubt, if you pay attention, that access radio broadcasts were the most popular and the most talked about. During the 1950s and 60s and all the way to the 70s, there's little doubt that Radio Ceylon was actually the most popular radio station. And same thing with the AIR Urdu service. At the same time, it's not a story of sort of straightforward resistance. It's also not a story that idealizes what radio does or what it could do. I think I want to be very clear of the problematic parts of each one of them. Sort of the ways in which Hindi film songs were a commercial and continue to be a commercial form of music that in many ways obscures other forms of musical expression. Same thing, and the Urdu service's focus on nostalgia is problematic as well, and the nostalgia for a past is problematic. And I don't have to say why access radio broadcasts are problematic. I mean, we all know that. At the same time, though, this is sort of the reality of what was heard on the radio and what was shared on the radio. And in telling radio stories, I think it was our duty to pay attention to what listeners were listening to.
Yeah, especially, I mean, we've seen a lot of literature in the past 1 or 2 decades on partition memories. And it seems like radio is a really fruitful source for getting those memories of people to be more publicly accessible. I mean, you talk about how a listener from Pakistan might write to AIR and ask about what life was like in a town that he or she left, like Delhi or Bulandshahr or Lucknow. And similarly, a listener from India might ask about what life was like in Lahore. I think you mentioned about how one listener asked about the Basant festival in Lahore and whether people still celebrated it. So it's quite poignant in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, radio in the 1970s was doing public history in many ways. And the AIR Urdu service certainly was doing what historians are sort of doing now. And it was doing it at a mass scale and a very popular scale. And it was doing it out of necessity because people needed to hear that. It was sort of a necessity thing to survive. People needed to have that. So yes, absolutely.
So as we come to the end of this podcast, I want to bring things up to the current moment. So, in current day South Asia, obviously AIR and Radio Pakistan are not as well listened to anymore. Radio Ceylon, I believe, stopped its Hindustani programming some time ago. But of course, we do have a rather active podcast environment in South Asia, on really all sides of all borders in South Asia. Do you see any sort of parallels between the radio ecosystem in South Asia up until maybe around 3 decades ago and what we're seeing today with podcasts in South Asia?
Yeah, well, I'm a historian, so I'm always a little worried to make sort of broad statements about the current moment. But I'll say a couple of things. Yes, I do think, first of all, I think this is a particularly exciting time to have published a book about radio broadcasting, because I began this research a decade ago when podcasting was just really starting off. And it's sort of, there's a boom of podcasting. There's a boom of the importance of sound material in South Asia and throughout the world. And I think that we are returning to a moment in which we really pay attention to oral media and oral experiences, and they become part of our everyday lives. I think it's different. I don't think it's the same. And I think it's different than the way that radio broadcasting did. And it's too early to tell it's too early for us to make conclusions about how they will resist state power. I think it's too early to tell that, but I think that the story of radio broadcasting, if anything, shows us that if we want to understand a medium's influence, paying attention to South Asia is actually crucial to that.
At the very end of your book, you recount a little bit of your own personal history. So for Radio for the Millions, you've written a transnational history, but as you recall, in your book, you yourself grew up along a very different border, the border between the US and Mexico, and your childhood was spent crossing that border and also listening to what was going on both sides of the border. How did that experience shape your approach towards this project, as well as your approach towards understanding transnational history, including the transnational history of sound?
Yeah, this is an interesting topic because it took me almost 10 decades it took me almost 10 years, 1 decade to sort of see that. So as you mentioned, I grew up on the US-Mexico border and the cities of Nuevo Laredo and Laredo, and I grew up really crossing the border for a period of my life every day, for a short period of my life every day. And my research obviously takes me to a very different part of the world, uses different languages. But when I began this project, I made it very clear that I wanted to study both India and Pakistan. Of course, a foreign passport allowed me to do that. But I was told over and over again that a dissertation should not do too much. So maybe I should select one of them. And for me, that story would be incomplete because the story could only be told if it was transborder. And the reason why I think I was so committed to that is because that's the world I knew. And that's the world that I would center. Because to me, that's the world I lived. And I think that that's what allowed me to center the cross-border experiences of people, because that's the one that I lived as well. It took me a long time to realize that connection. And it was actually in the classroom that I began to see that was at the center of it. The other thing I want to mention that I think is very important is when I was completing this book, I was having trouble articulating the main argument. And particularly when studying the AR Urdu service program and the role of these letters that were performed on the radio, trying to explain why it matters. The border is still there. Going across the border becomes impossible for most Pakistanis, and for the people that I featured in my radio would have been impossible to get visas at the time period. And radio didn't break down those barriers. So why does it matter? And I found the answer in some of the scholarship on sound studies and borders. It was reading Inés Casillas' book on Spanish language radio, Sounds of Belonging, and Alex Chavez's book on music across borders called Sounds of Crossings, that allowed me to see the value and the importance in these performances. That they might not break down borders, but they're crucial aspects of people's everyday lives. And it's our duty as historians and as scholars to study them in that way. And it was Alex Chavez's idea of Sounds of Crossings that enabled me to write that final chapter of the book and to sort of bring it all together with the conclusion. So it's not just my background, I say, and growing up where I did and the ways in which I did, and the attention I paid to cross-border experiences throughout my research, but also the scholarship that I read out of interest that allowed me, I think, to sort of bring it all together and put it together.
I'm sure the experience you're describing, or in your book, or your personal experience as well, growing up on the US Mexico border, is in many ways similar to experiences that people have on other hostile borders. I'm sure, for example, if we were to talk to someone from pre-1989 Germany or anyone else living on, close by to the Iron Curtain between between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, there'd be similar stories that you would hear of how radio allowed you to cross borders without actually stepping across them.
I mean, I think absolutely. And I think that's where a lot of the research is going. radio has had, while radio has been in many parts state control, it has never been able to stay within the borders of the state simply because of the way the medium works. So there's a lot of that story to be told. But I also think that we can extend that a little further than that. I think that part of what the book wants to do is to decenter the role of the state. And in saying that, I'm not saying that the state is not powerful. I'm not saying that the state does not do things that are that shape our lives. What I'm saying is that there are ways in which people find to live, to continue to resist on their everyday lives, and that it's very important to pay attention to those particular stories. And I think anyone that grew up like me, who knows from a very deep way that the border is at the same time rigid and porous, will tell similar stories that will decenter the state, even as they know that their lives have been affected by the state. And I think that's sort of at the key of it. And that is about studying sound, but also just about how you study anything. So as you have more and more people like me that grew up in between places and in between everything, I think we will have more studies that do that.
So I think the book that you present is a really important study for not just the history of radio, but in many ways, transnational history in South Asia. The last thing I want to ask you is, now that you have this book out, where is your research taking you? What future projects do you have in mind?
That's a very nice question. Too many to begin with. I have a few going on. One is I'm very interested in the role of narrative. And I think this is related to the podcast and how sound creates narratives. So as I mentioned, one of the projects that I want to pursue later is looking at a variety of radio narratives that were created in the 60s and 70s in Hindi, Urdu, and in English, and the ways in which sound has been crucial to the creation of narrative. One of the things that I'm currently writing is on the notion of fan fiction that was read on the radio on the AR Urdu service and Radio Ceylon, and they're called Geeto Bari Kahaniyan. So they're stories full of songs, and they use songs from that. So that's the first narrative that I'm going to be exploring in that project. But there's a few others that I have. I'm also interested in maybe later in a long time further pursuing my love for Noor Jahan and maybe something biographical on her. It's extremely hard to do so because of sources, but I find her to be a really fascinating and important character. And it also allows me to pursue something that I wish I had more on the book, which I do, but I think there was room for a lot more, and I want to pursue more, which is gender and the role of gender and what is it that women's voices did on the radio. And I want to do that more through her. And then lastly, as you know, Dinyar, I'm also very, very interested in the role of radio in Goa. I studied Portuguese earlier on in my life, and I was able to interview a few broadcasters from Emisora de Goa. So it's something that I also hope to at some time pursue.
Those sound like a lot of projects to keep you busy. So I wish you luck with working on them.
Too many.
Isabel, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. For all of our listeners who are interested in learning more about the history of radio, this is a book that we can strongly recommend for understanding not just aspects of radio history, but important aspects of Indian history or Pakistani history or even Sri Lankan history as well. So thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Dinyar.
You were listening to Past Imperfect, a special podcast series by SPJIMR. Brought to you by SPJIMR's Center for Wisdom and Leadership. Produced by Vinita Dwivedi.